Great. So, okay. So the presentation today, as Jyour mentioned, is going to be about, a paper that I've been working on with some colleagues over a few years now. And as Jyour mentioned already, is going to be related to this idea of the free energy principle, active inference. And especially we're going to focus on a construct that seems to appear regularly in the literature of these two frameworks. That is something called the Markov Blankets. I will go through, say, the formal definition of a blanket, and then try to, say, unpack, I guess, the main argument of the paper, which is basically, well, it is not always going by the definition. So in the literature, we will find that there are different things that people mean by this word. I will try by the end of it to highlight that there are some things that are, not as simple as we might think. They are not just coming from the maths, and they are not just coming for free. They will need to be further discussed. And then by the very, very end of it, I will try to flesh out a few things, like a few opinions, basically on how to move forward and what I actually believe is needed for a thorough and proper discussion of these frameworks. So this is the team. Honestly, I would recommend to you to talk to each one of us, because we do have different backgrounds, we do have different opinions about some of this stuff. We did agree on, the paper as a whole, but it is honestly always a great experience to be able to, have a debate with each one of them, because, well, it is really, they are really great people. So I can only but recommend to, have them also give a presentation at some point. We also have a reply to, I think it was 35 commentaries we received to the paper. The thing is kind of there, but not really available yet. So, I might mention something during the presentation, but I will not be spoiling too much. Okay, so this is an old meme that I prepared, I think, I don't know, last year, a couple of years ago. And basically, it's a bit of, a personal take on the landscape of papers about active inference. It goes from, joking to really, really joking. So don't take this too seriously. But I think it is a good starting point to really say what I want to focus on. So basically, I want to focus on claims about active inference free energy principle being a framework of everything. And I will try to unpack what the difference is between these two words, these two, say, concepts actually are, in my opinion. And then I will try to say something about the ways people, are working around these two frameworks, trying to fix some of the current shortcomings. So to start off, very, very general perspective on what I mean by free energy principle and what I think people should actually recognize as the free energy principle. Basically, this is a foundational theory of agents, living systems, and more recently, things. And I will try then later to say what I mean by thing. By foundational, I mean that this is supposed to tell us what a thing is, what a living system is. It is not supposed to be assuming that, it's supposed to be telling us what it is. And a thing is a thing only if it minimizes variation of free energy. This is the main claim. Markov Blankets appear there because they tell us that there are two things. Well, I shouldn't be using the word thing now so easily. There are two, say, partitions of a system, one that is called internal, one that is called external, and the internal is the thing doing inference about external. But I will come back to that later. What do I mean by active inference? Well, basically, I mean taking a state space model, say structure, or partial observable Markov decision processes. Oh, POM-DPs, that's wrong. And basically try to use a specific cost function, which in active inference is this expected free energy. And what I believe is really important to focus on is that this is a framework that I believe can stand without the foundational aspect of the free energy principle. This doesn't have to tell us what a thing is. It doesn't have to tell us what an agent is. We can just assume that they exist and we can just say that we are going to model them as some partially observable Markov decision process, and then do inference according to a specific cost function. These two, I think, can exist independently, and this thread will come, useful by the end of the talk. This is a very long slide. I really hate slides with a lot of text, but I thought that this one is the only exception. Okay, there's another one later on, but that's more, I guess, I will go less in detail about the following one. This is really important because I'm trying to, fix a few concepts. What I think the free energy principle is, this is going to be what I'm going to talk about, at least portions of this, for the rest, say, of this 50 and something minutes. So the free energy principle says that you need to start with a system that can be modeled as some random dynamical system. This system needs to have, and make sure this is in the title. This is something, around early 2021. I know that there's something new, but for now, let me fix a few concepts. So a random dynamical system, this system needs to have a unique steady state distribution, and the flow of this random dynamical system can be decomposed into two components of a quasi-potential, one that is divergence-free, meaning that it's just, something rotating around the steady state, and something that is curve-free, which is basically something that goes directly down to, it's basically a gradient component of this quasi-potential. It's quasi-potential because it's not a proper potential in the sense that it's not just a gradient of something because there's a curly part. At steady state, the free energy principle claims that we can basically partition a system into internal, external, and blanket states. And this is an assumption that comes, say, on top of everything else. It's not derived from everything. It's not implied from everything I've said so far. One needs to select some specific variables and say, well, this will be my internal, or this will be my external. Everything else will come, say, because, well, from the complementarity, basically, of the system as a whole. Then there needs to be a special, say, assumption regarding how to connect what I just said about the partitions of internal, external, and blanket states at steady state, how to connect these partitions to the dynamical, say, representation of this random dynamical system. So how is this steady state telling me anything about the flows of this random dynamical system? And Friston has something he calls a conjecture, a sparse coupling conjecture, that is basically saying that, yeah, if you knock out some of these divergence-free components, you're going to be able to do something about it. And I'm not going to go too technical into that. It's something we can discuss at the end, after the talk. On top of that, we need something that Friston calls a synchronization map, that is saying, well, again, another assumption that is saying, well, now that I have internal and external states, I'm going to say that there is some non-trivial map between the sufficient statistics of internal and external states. And I'm going to say that this is what allows me, by the end of this free energy principle, to say that there is a sense in which one partition models the other partition. This is not unproblematic, but yeah, I will leave you to Miguel's paper, Aguilera, 2021, who's discussing quite a lot of the possible implications of this assumption in particular. Okay, now that we have all of these assumptions lined up, the claim that the free energy principle makes is that we can describe internal states as appearing to do approximate Bayesian inference on external states. And this is what they call the approximate Bayesian inference lemma. Importantly, I will only be focusing on point 4. Everything else I'm not saying that everything else is unproblematic. I'm just saying, every other point could be a talk in and by itself. I will be focusing on 4, which is basically what we wrote about in the paper. I might be mentioning something about 5, but yeah, don't get too carried away hoping that I will go technical about that, because, well, 4 is already quite a handful. Trust me on that. Okay, as I was mentioning, I'm aware that there are more recent developments, especially, trying to relax some of the assumptions that I mentioned earlier. So the fact that we don't need weakly mixing systems, we don't need ergodicity apparently anymore, we only need stationarity. To be fair, this is claimed in a paper, but the system that they are using, as far as I can tell, is still ergodic. So, I'll leave it at that. I might be wrong, but yeah, I haven't seen this actually proven. There is a sense in which we have, multiple definitions of blankets, and I will go through what I call the zoo. And later on, the other slide I mentioned that is quite handful. And I'm aware that there's also an attempt to develop a free energy principle for non-stationary processes that would be pretty cool. And this is, say, where the graphic on the right actually comes from a paper actually claiming to, work in that direction. But as far as I can tell, and, don't quote me on this, I know it's a pretty long paper and I haven't had the time to go into full detail. But I guess that the graphic is pretty clear. Basically, if you don't assume stationarity, so this nest non-equilibrium steady state that we see on the left, then basically we don't really have a proper definition of blankets, and we don't really have the approximate Bayesian inference lemma, which in my understanding is the whole claim behind the free energy principle. So if we don't have that, I'm less sure, what exactly we're talking about. Okay, so now I'm going to really start from the basics, and I'm going to try and, tell you a story about these blankets and where I think, things have started to change. So I'm going to use a graphical language on the right, which is hopefully something you've seen before and hopefully something that is slightly more intuitive. But bear in mind, we can do this completely analytically with the things, say, in the middle. The graphical language is a nice decoration, I think, because it helps grasping an intuition. But yeah, don't get too carried away thinking the Markov blankets, as I will define them, only exist in graphical models, because that's not true. We can use a different language like, factor graphs or whatever else, and we can still define something. So joint probability. What do I mean by that? Well, by that, I basically mean that we have some variables and we're just looking at the system as a whole. This is the distribution of X and Y joint. I know that, there are a lot of things that I will, not cover in terms of, theory of probability distributions and, measure theory, because this is not the right place and time. Conditional probability, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean to know what the probability of a variable X is given that I know something about Y. What do you mean by marginal independence? By marginal independence, I mean that the probability of X, for example, does not depend on Y. So if we look at the graphical language, we don't have an arrow between the two. By conditional independence, I'm drawing an example here. Bear in mind there are more, but it's not important to go through all of them right now. I mean to say that if I have a variable X and a variable Y, and in this case, a variable Z in the middle, I can say that X and Y are conditionally independent given Z. So X does not depend on Y if I know something about Z. And I'll leave it at that. So what is a Markov blanket, like, in all of this? Well, if the whole model I had was actually, this Y, Z, X that I drew earlier, then I could say that Z is essentially the Markov blanket for X or for Y. So it's the thing that makes X and Y conditionally independent. And that's about it. That's what a Markov blanket is. Now, to give a full story, I guess I should say that, if we have a more complicated model than saying that, Z makes X and Y conditionally independent would not be the full story. It would just be saying that, it is something that helps making X and Y independent, but there are other variables in the middle. So in this case, I should say that T, Z, and W are the thing that makes X independent, conditionally independent from Y. So Z in this case is part of the blanket, but it's not the blanket. There's a more formal definition that I could give, but yeah, I think this is probably more than enough to grasp an intuition. This is a Markov blanket as defined by Pearl in his book, 1988. Okay, So now what I want to say is that, the definition of this Markov blanket is pretty clear. It's like 3 lines in the book by Pearl. And, this thing, has been used for about 2 decades successfully, I would say, for people, by people trying to do inference on different problems in machine learning. This is a definition that is, say, quite recurrent in standard textbooks, from Bishop to, what's the name of the other one? Murphy. And you can pick up your favorite, like, say, inference, machine learning book, and you will find the same definition of Markov blanket. Now, what I want to point out is, while this is also, while this has been applied successfully in machine learning, there has been a point, say, in time where, things actually changed. And this is basically what I will use to explain the turn in this history of Markov blankets, and the need that we saw to actually have 2 different names for 2 different things. So at the same time, say, while people were using Markov blankets to do inference in machine learning models, people started wondering, okay, can we actually say that the brain is a system doing inference? And then you see all of these books and, 20 years of, say, literature on predictive coding, Bayesian brain hypothesis, early stages, free energy principle, etc., etc. What I would say is a big, turn of events, as I mentioned earlier, is happening sometime around 2012. There's a paper by Friston and Jyour where they mention, where they start talking about Markov blankets as being something that separates internal from external. And Friston, being a neuroscientist, mentions something about the brain basically being the internal and the environment being the external, and probably the body being this Markov blanket. But I think it's kind of, say, out there. It's not really neither here nor there, I guess, by 2012. Things, however, change, I think, more drastically when we get to 2013. There's this paper, Life as We Know It, by Friston, that actually starts to make big claims about, origins of life, and how Markov blankets apparently are a special structure, a very important structure, fundamental structure that we should study to understand the origins of life. Not only that, this later gets pushed into, studying origins of agency, origins of different systems. More importantly, however, I think this is where things actually start to change, because after that we see, around 9 years, 2022, of, Markov blankets of life, mind, cell, sex and gender, pain experience, religious practices, climate and ecosystems, etc., etc. And I'm not making them up. These have all been coming out in the literature, say, inspired by Friston's work. And more importantly, I'm not trying to make fun of these ideas. I'm just trying to say that there is a big difference, a big shift in the types of claims that have been made before, say, Friston started to use Markov blankets in his work, and after. Again, make sure, this is just to say that there is something that has to be unpacked there, needs to be unpacked. Okay, so what do I actually mean by things that I believe need to be unpacked? Basically, here is where I will start talking about Pearl or Friston blankets. By Pearl blankets, I will mean the initial definition of Markov blankets, the one that we find in Pearl's book, 1988. And by Friston blankets, I will mean what actually happens once Friston starts to say, well, okay, this thing might actually be important to understand, origins of life, and perhaps, like, definitions of different things of importance to neuroscientists, biologists, social scientists. So what do I actually mean is happening? Well, I would say that in the literature, we often find that people, there's some papers actually claim, well, Friston blankets are just a stochastic processes version of Pearl blankets. This is something I will unpack in a couple of slides. It basically means that we move from a time-independent definition of Pearl blankets to something that should be working for time series. And This is great. You know, if true, this would be already like a big advancement, something that, you know, is already like doing a lot of work. But what I would say, and what we say in the paper, is that essentially there are other changes happening at the same time. So there is something that has to do with modeling. So Markov blankets and inference happening with a model or within a model, and I will unpack that later. And there is something to be said about the metaphysical or epistemic status that is attributed to this blankets. So in my opinion, you know, Friston blankets actually are somewhere in there. They are not really saying much about stochastic processes because they need to assume that they are stationary. So, you know, time is really not a variable there at the end of the day. And I would say that they are pushing quite into the metaphysical realm, not always, but, you know, more often than not. And I would say that they make this big change between within the model, which is, you know, the thing that actually got me and got us like to make a big point about this in the paper. And, you know, you also see in the title, inference with or within a model. Okay, so starting from random variables or stochastic processes. Okay, this is where, you know, I will try to give an intuition for what I think some of the parts, some of the working parts of this idea actually are, but it is not something that I guess I can fully unpack without, say, doing a lot of maths, and that's not the goal of this talk, at least. So far I've been talking about, you know, Markov blankets as, you know, a bunch of variables that make another two bunches of variables conditionally independent. So T, Z, and W are shielding. People like to use this word for blankets, shielding Y from X or X from Y. Now, this is fairly intuitive, and the definition, as I said, is like 3 lines. The thing is less obvious when we had time series. So here read like 3 time series, X, Y, Z, going left to right, different time steps. And this is also not a really nice one in the sense that we have time this is non-time homogeneous in the sense that we have different connection at each time step. And in this case, I guess that the main question that people are asking is what exactly needs to be conditionally independent from everything else. The thing is, if I choose a single variable y1, it is pretty easy to just apply the same thing, the same rules that we have for random variables for the per blankets 1988. The thing, however, is that people usually use this, say, time series model to say that we have a system that is evolving over time. So Y2 is the same Y1, but at a different time step. And Y3 is the same as Y2, but at a different time step. Different things might have happened, but we have a concept of identity over time. As, you know, as weak or as strong as you would like that to be, there needs to be some concept of identity for this thing to be used, for example, in biology or neuroscience. This is a specific, say, you know, recording of a brain area over time, or this is a specific something else. Okay, now, if I want to say that X is independent from Z in this case, well, I need to look at all of the possible connection between, say, X and Z through Y at different time steps. In that case, the definition of a blanket is much more complicated because we need to consider different time steps. And then in that case, are you saying that the thing needs to be, the whole history of a system needs to be independent from the whole history, sorry, of a partition needs to be independent from the whole history of another partition? Do you want to say that it's just at a particular time step? Do you want to say that it's one time step independent of all of the history of the other partition? The thing is not obvious. I think I'll leave it at that. And it is not obvious to an extent where, you know, different papers have tried to unpack how different assumptions have very different implications. If you assume some things, you will not be able to do a lot. If you try to be more general, you will not get a good definition. And if you try, it's a long story. It's something we can discuss later, but otherwise I'll leave it at that. What I will try to say, you know, at least poke at, is the idea that we don't have a clear definition of Friston blankets. Like, you know, I tried to give you different, say, possible intuitive assumptions we might use to model blankets on time series, on stochastic processes. And, you know, different assumptions have come out like in different parts of the literature. And basically by that, I mean that there seem to be some inconsistency. And this is the other slide I said I don't like walls of text, but I thought that this was actually important to really highlight what the literature actually looks to me. We have the initial definition of, you know, pair blankets, that's fine, 1988. We have Markov blankets that could be simply interpreted in terms of Markov chains. So, you know, the future of something is conditionally independent of the past given the present. And this is something that Perl himself was using as early as 1989 for some work in there. This is also something that Friston in 2021 finally made clear. This is not what I really mean by a Friston, well, a Markov blanket, what I call a Friston blanket. Now, this is clear in a paper 2021 after Beal and others actually tried to ask for some clarifications. There is a Markov blanket in the 2013 Life as We Know It. And that basically is a pair blanket of the stationary distribution. And then this is claimed that somehow it's also a Friston blanket for dynamical, for the flow terms, but it is never clarified why. And this actually is what ignited like the need for the paper by Beal and others. Beal and others actually come up with a counterexample, say, well, you know, I can have something like a pair blanket, but that doesn't say anything about the dynamical, the decomposition of dynamical flows of this dynamical system. And then Friston after that says, oh, no, okay, it's really not what I mean because you're making extra assumptions and we don't like that. It's, you know, Occam's razor, extra assumptions, they are kind of useless. Okay. Then we have Friston actually giving a full definition, 2021, saying, well, you know, if you knock out some of these divergence-free components, the solenoidal components of the decomposed flow, then you're going to have that a pair blanket at steady state is has direct connections to a decomposition of flows. Okay. So is this the Friston blanket? I'm not sure. I put in a question mark there because, you know, it is still a bit unclear to me. Why is it unclear? Because then we have another definition, again, 2021. If we look at one of the appendices, we see that there is some linearization process happening and something, some assumptions that the non-equilibrium system is actually really close to equilibrium, which means that all of the solenoidal components are disappearing, blah, blah, blah. So is that what is actually meant by a Friston blanket? Not sure. This is something that Aguilera is actually, you know, discussing in their paper. Then we have attempts to actually create a definition that is perhaps useful to the free energy principle, but that starts from different assumptions. The causal blanket by Rosas starts from computational mechanics and doesn't need to assume stationarity and has a lot of other nice properties. Then we have a definition in one of the commentaries to our paper coming from Virgo and others, where they try to basically unpack what I was mentioning earlier. So how do we ask, for example, the two different, say, variables at a specific point in time are actually condition independent, given the whole history, so that we don't need to assume stationarity. Something, again, we can discuss at the end. In our reply to the commentaries, we also found like 2 or 3 different definitions that were already in the literature. They didn't call it blanket of anything, but they are definitions of conditional independence that apply to stochastic processes, and they are already out there. Okay, all of this to say, there is a reason to talk about Pearl and Friston blankets. It is not a clear map, as some works try to imply. It is really not clear. I'm not saying anything needs to be wrong, but I'm saying it is not by any means clear. Okay, now let's get to the main point. Inference with or within a model. So the main idea here is to say that pair blankets are usually claimed, and usually I would say probably, and they are always claimed to be a tool that a modeler, so crazy scientist on the left, uses to make inference about a system, for example, brain, on the right, using some kind of model. So the Markov blanket is some property of a model that a modeler uses to make inference about a system. Great. This is inference with a model. There is a scientist making inferences about a system with a model, the thing in the middle. Inference within a model is a bit different, because in this case, we don't really have a modeler. The modeler is supposed to disappear from this picture. What we have happening is that the model itself is partitioned in what I said at the very beginning, so internal, external Markov blanket states. And then the claim is that internal states are making are doing some inference about external ones through the blanket. Now, I'm leaving a bunch of question marks here because, well, you know, you'll see in a couple of seconds, but the whole point of inference with or within a model is that there is no modeler. Now, the inference is happening within the model. There is a model that can be partitioned, and one of these partitions is the one doing inference. And this is the cool, the cool part, to be honest. Like, you know, if this works, you know, this is a really cool, perspective on what is actually happening. Okay. Basically, you know, the things that I was mentioning at the very beginning, like, you know, we see things actually coming out quite a lot when people now talk about this free energy principle. These things are supposed to be, the internal states of a particular model. So if I start with some graphical model, and remember, I don't have to, but it's a really nice tool in this case to actually try and explain what I really want to say. If we start with some, graphical model, after choosing a particular target variable, I can find the blanket for the target variable and say that everything that is not part of the blanket then is external. In say in purple on the right, we see the say the thing, and in green and red we see the blanket that is organized by sensory and active states. Sensory being active being all of the nodes that are directly influenced by the target variable, and the coparents of the other active states, hence why this is actually active. And the sensory states are supposed to be all of the other ones that are still part of the blanket but are not active. The thing is the internal thing. So this is supposed to be your microorganism at the origins of life. This is supposed to be your brain doing inference about the environment. This is supposed to be your mind, whatever that is. This is supposed to be your agent. This is supposed to be, a bunch of things. Great. So to, I guess, recap this point, this is a picture that probably you have seen quite a lot in the literature that we reproduced from some of the active inference, well, I should say free energy principle papers. Internal, as I said, might actually be your brain. External might be the environment, and sensory states are the ones where you're getting, say, your information from the environment, and active states are the ones where you're giving some of your information to the environment. Okay, now the question marks from earlier were there for a specific reason. So I left some question marks because essentially what I'm asking is, once you tell me that you're doing inference within a model, so the model disappears from this picture, and now we're left with the model and a system that this model is supposed to refer to, are you actually saying that the Markov blankets within the model are actually telling me something about the system that I'm trying to model? Are you trying to say that they are exactly a feature of the system I'm trying to model? Are you trying to say that the system I'm trying to model is in itself some sort of graphical model? You know, there are different positions, and I think I'll leave it at that. In our reply, we try like to flash out a spectrum of different positions taken by different authors, and you know, just argue that these things actually need to be clarified. When people actually use Friston blankets in the literature, they might still mean different things. Because some people interpret that literally, some people interpret that as some sort of nice metaphor, and some other people are a bit more ambiguous about that. Something we, you know, argue, and you know, something that we believe begs for, you know, clarification is whether some people actually believe that these blankets actually are properties of the system we are trying to model. And we did find that a few papers actually equate a blanket, a Friston blanket, with a cell membrane. They equate a Friston blanket with whatever separates the mind from something else. They actually do say that there's a direct mapping. They are not specific, like in terms of whether they mean identity, whether they mean isomorphism, whether they mean some other, like, you know, a more exotic type of relation, but they are quite specific about being a very strong relationship. And, you know, here I'm just highlighting a few, say, examples of what I mean by that. It is not trying like to call out anyone specifically. It's just trying to say that, yeah, there are, you know, different positions being taken, and some of them are pretty strong. Some of them say, well, these blankets are actually fundamental properties of a system. Now, you know, some people have actually told us, well, you know, you're taking things a bit too literally. And, you know, there's a paper now basically calling us and other people out saying, well, you know, you actually fell, you know, for this. You actually fell for this, and now you actually believe that people, you know, think that the universe is just a big graphical model, and that's why you're claiming that Friston blankets have this sort of very, you know, challenging status to be explained. And to that, I just want to say that I guess no, not really. We are not trying to claim that anyone believes that, although we did have probably some commentaries that actually pointed at that. So in the same way we have, you know, people arguing for the universe to be a big cellular automaton, we have some people that might be arguing that, yeah, the universe is a big Bayesian network. I guess, you know, that's a position that people could take. We are not accusing anyone of doing that, but we're just pointing out that the connection between, you know, a property of a model and the thing in the environment is really not clear. You have plenty of blankets that are not cell membranes, and conditional independencies between things that are really not that interesting to model. A difference in this case is quite clear if we, for example, bring in an example from the literature of artificial life. And I thank Jyour for, you know, mentioning that at the very beginning. You know, Randall Beers has been studying gliders in the game of life for the best part of the last 2 decades, and has been, you know, trying to model autopoiesis in the game of life and different aspects of autopoiesis. Now, does that tell us something directly about biological systems? Well, not really. We're not going to find that anywhere claimed in Randall Beers' work. His work is actually focused on the game of life, and, you know, it's supposed to give us a series of toy models to study autopoiesis. The connections from that to real autopoietic systems is not something that comes for free. The game of life is lacking a lot of features that are pretty crucial to actually model biology. So the claims there are a bit weaker in a sense compared to what the free energy principle, for example, at times claims. Okay, as I was just mentioning, you know, claims. Well, you know, if we have to compare the claims made by Pearl and Friston blankets, you know, they fit quite nicely, I guess, even in a single slide. We have the Pearl blankets focus on random variables as opposed to stochastic processes in Friston blankets. So the time variable is not really, you know, crucial. or part of the definition of per blankets is supposed to be somewhere in the Friston version. Per blankets are usually epistemic. I'm sure there are people that are taking them more ontologically than others, but usually they are more epistemic than not. Friston blankets at times, they are really, the cell membrane. They are really like the skull around your brain. They are really something. Or they are read as really being something. Per blankets, to use per blankets, you actually need to assume which variable you want to do inference on, and then find the blanket for that, so that you can just consider a subset of the other variables of the system. And the whole inference process starts from the assumption of a variable of interest. Friston blankets, on the other hand, are supposed to be part of a theory that tells you what the system of interest is. So it's supposed to be able to tell me that there is a cell, as opposed to half a cell. If I cut a cell in a half, that thing is going to dissipate, whatever, something. But the Friston blankets thing is supposed to be part of a system that tells me, well, this is a thing, cell. This is not a thing, half a cell. More importantly, then, once we assume a system of interest, like per blankets become part of an inference process, and the inference process is actually done by a modeler on a system with a model. Friston blankets, on the other hand, take away the scientist, take away the modeler, and they tell us that within the system we are looking at, there is something doing inference about something else. So it's a very different perspective. Honestly, a very interesting one. The question, I guess, is whether that is really what is happening. And now, for those of you, I'm hoping I mentioned that in the right way. So, if I'm right, you should be able to go back to the recording. I think it was like the second point of this, or the like three-dimensional spectrum of blankets, where I tried to explain how Friston blankets actually work. And if if I'm right, you should be able to say, you should be able to see that I mentioned something that is really not fitting comfortably with the claims that that we found in the literature, and with the claims that I summarized just in the previous slide. What do I mean by that? Well, the thing is, if I give you a graphical model, that's great. That helps us understanding, what is actually happening with some bunch of random variables or stochastic processes. The thing is, when we use Friston blankets, we still need to assume what the internal variables actually are. This is, something that you can see in basically all of the papers. They actually use these Friston blankets. In the Life as We Know It paper, yeah, they take like 8 variables and they say, yeah, this will be our internal stage. Then we'll find the blanket, an external one. The thing is, they could have chosen 12 and the thing will be different. So actually believing that those 8 variables are actually representative of something like a protocell is honestly a bit hard to follow, hard to grasp, because you could have chosen 8, 6, 12, and the thing will still work. Like, this framework is not telling you how to find the thing. You need to say what the thing is and then actually find the blanket for that thing. When we look at some of the analyses that were done on brain data, well, in that case, the conditional independencies are not really present due to, say, noise in the recordings, and due to some of the modeling being done like before inference can actually, say, be applied to the model. And in that case, we see that, there is a thresholding happening, and this is, very openly, say, expressed by Friston. So I'm not accusing anyone of hiding this. I'm just saying that this is happening. Like, there is somebody thresholding conditional independencies and say, oh, okay, below 0 point something something, this is like conditionally independent. And that process, as far as I know, could be done post-hoc. So you look at the data and you say, oh, okay, there's this area of the brain, and I know there are some constraints, like, topological constraints about this, say, all of these brain cells are in the vicinity of each other. There's a specific neuronal group that I'm aware of, that is a specific something. So, you know, what you could be doing is just thresholding all of the conditional dependencies from, you know, neurons part of this group and everything else. So you kind of had to assume that thing to begin with. Then you can do all of your nice analysis and, you know, tell me the story about Friston blankets. So the thing actually there is assumed. And the sensory motor interpretation that is now applied even to neurons, so neurons are sensing and acting and doing stuff, which I think is really cool, is still done by actually making assumptions about, you know, what the thing of interest is. If you cut a neuron in half, well, you know, in theory, you could still run the same type of analysis, but it would be much less interesting. Okay, so, you know, I'm approaching the end. And, you know, here I will be stealing very openly a title that I found absolutely great as in one of the commentaries to our paper. And that basically summarizes, I guess, the thing that I called the elephant in the room just in the previous slide. Who tailors this blanket? So in paired blankets, we know that there is a modeler choosing the variable of interest, find the blanket, and then we apply our, you know, inference algorithm, and then we do all of our cool analysis, and, you know, we can start claiming stuff. In, say, Friston blankets, well, the thing is, we are still doing the same thing. We still need to choose a variable. So even if the modeler disappears, it cannot disappear before a variable of interest is chosen. So the part where I said, oh yeah, the thing is happening within a model, well, it's happening within a model once we chose the variable of interest. Then we find the blanket, and then say we start doing inference. But in this case, you know, it is claimed that the inference is being done by the thing we are choosing. And in that case, you know, the claims honestly are a bit more ambiguous, because, you know, if you chose the thing and you're saying that that thing is actually doing inference, it is less clear, I guess, what the final claim really is. And I guess I'll leave it at that. There is another possible issue that I will not cover. It's somewhere in the paper, but, you know, it might seem minor, but it's really not. Something I was mentioning earlier about co-parents. What are co-parents? So in this case, let's look at these different graphical models. If I choose a specific variable of interest, S, M is what is called a child of S, and it's part of the blanket because it's supposed to be a variable that is influenced by S. Now, K is also part of the blanket as something called a co-parent. So it's basically another parent of M, and it is also something that is directly influenced by having or not having knowledge about S. The thing is, it is probably quite trivial to imagine that if we choose a specific variable of interest, all of the children of that variable of interest are kind of like, you know, actions in a sense. They are things that are directly influenced by our thing of interest. It is less clear why K is supposed to be an action, I guess, of this S, because it's not really an action. In fact, in this model, it's basically, you know, we are looking at a patellar reflex on your knee, and K will be, if I'm correct, like the, say, like the hammer coming from a doctor. And, you know, in that case, you know, it is really not clear what is an agent in this picture. Like, is it the internal thing? Is it the internal thing plus the blanket? But if you include the blanket, then you have these sort of, you know, strange situations where co-parents are actually things that are not really part of the internal, that are not really directly influenced by the internal thing. So, you know, it is probably a big deal, but it is also something that, yeah, it is not central, I guess, to the main point of this presentation. So, you know, there's a section in the paper, I'll leave it at that, or for discussion later. Okay, so that brings me to basically the end, where I have just a few slides where I try like to picture what I think should be happening, or what we should look forward to happening, you know, given the type of context that I set up. So basically, in the reply to the commentaries, with commentaries saying being, spread over a different range of positions with respect to this Friston blankets and the free energy principle, we basically try to condense what we believe are 4 possible ways forward. The first one is pretty simple. We're just saying, well, we just need some clarity. We need people to actually tell us what they mean when they invoke a blanket in their words. The second one, argues that we might actually look for a free energy principle without blankets and see what that means. We might even, as a third one, consider, what I mentioned at the very beginning. So active inference as being some sort of, alternative framework to reinforcement learning, different cost function, different perhaps inference algorithms or whatever. That is in a very strong sense independent from the claims of the free energy principle, whereby we actually don't need to assume that we are defining an agent, we just need to assume that there is an agent. The fourth one is something that I would call like beyond the free energy principle. And, I will unpack in just a few seconds. So by more clarity, you can actually probably imagine the point I was going to make anyway. It is not a single axis we're looking at. It is not just a move from random variables to stochastic processes we're looking at. And, not only that move is not trivial, and probably brings some problems already, but we have different moves, and 2 that I tried to summarize. So with 2 within a model, and perhaps epistemic 2 metaphysical, and these are 3 axes, but probably there are even more things happening, and these are not say cheap shots. They're honestly just a way to say that this is not, that this is something that needs to be unpacked. When people actually talk about Markov blankets in the literature of free energy principle, more often than not, they mean one of the 10 different things that I listed in the zoo of blankets. And it is not clear which one people mean at different points and in different parts of the literature. So clarity, pretty simple. If we consider the free energy principle without Friston blankets, well, we first need to look at what happens when we have them. So, we need to have an assumption of stationarity, as the latest paper still seems to imply. And the inference learning that we might be talking about very crucially, and this is something we can discuss later, is only happening away from the blanket. Like if you are in a stationary state, there's no real learning that is happening. There's no real inference, I guess, at least in a trivial sense, that is happening. So, in a paper where people start like to say, oh, but this is really actually not true. Like, we don't need stationarity. Well, the thing they do there is just, show a simulation where they just bump a system out of stationary state, and then they let it relax to stationary state again and say, oh, see, during this relaxation, inference and learning are happening. Well, yes, that's the whole point. They cannot happen if you are in a stationary state. If we say do away with them, then it is less clear what the partition between internal and external will be. There are other definitions, but it is less clear whether some of the claims made by the free energy principle will actually stand anyway. Crucially, I think that the main point made by the free energy principle, so the presence of internal states doing inference about external states, say, captured by this approximate Bayesian inference lemma, it is all but obvious without blankets. So if there is no approximate Bayesian inference lemma, is there still a free energy principle? I don't know. I actually don't know. Third point, so active inference without a free energy principle. I guess that, usually people see just, a single spectrum of development for free energy principle and active inference. And they say, well, it started in 2006. Oh, what if the brain was a thing doing inference about blah, 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 following accounts of predictive coding. And there's about, 7 years of, models of brain activity, cognition, learning, perception, action, agency, attention, etc., etc. There's the 2013 Life as We Know It paper, where things seem to move from just neuroscience to the whole field of theoretical biology. And then there's a big paper in 2019, the so-called monograph by Friston, where he tries to say that this principle may actually apply to all non-equilibrium, all out of equilibrium systems in a thermodynamic sense. So not only biology, but also, say, physical systems out of equilibrium, with some specific, say, extra constraints for biological ones. Next ones, you know, I'm leaving their maths because of some recent work that has been done in terms of especially category theory, and even like some of the recent work in differential geometry, where the free energy principle is being laid down like in a specific and I guess more precise mathematical form that could actually tell us something else. Now, as I said, like, you know, some people see this as a single spectrum. I honestly tend to see this more as a branching process, where at least since 2013, we had, you know, active inference doing stuff with Markov Blankets, you know, just normal inference with a different cost function. We had the free energy principle with Friston blankets. So all of the stuff that I've been talking about during this presentation. And we had an attempt to explain active inference with the specific choice of a cost function derived from this Friston blanket and all of the other assumptions that I had at the very beginning. And I think these three can work mostly independently. So, you know, we could do all of our cool active inference models without actually having to explain the origins of things, agency, minds, and life. And I think this is a viable option. Beyond the FEP, and this is really the last slide, which probably brings me to the 60 minutes that was given. This is something, you know, that it's largely under development, and, you know, that I'm shamefully advertising with some people on the right that I think are doing some really cool work. So Nathaniel Virgo, Martin Beale, Simon McGregor, trying to say, capture some of the main ideas of the FEP in a category theoretic, say, framework based, say, on synthetic probabilities, Markov categories, and all of the cool stuff happening there at this point in time. And on the right, like something that I'm trying to work on, still actually not working, honestly, but where I'm trying to study, some of the stuff, some of the claims made by the free energy principle and actually inspired by cybernetics and all of the other cool stuff in control theory back in the 70s, through a also category theoretic lens, no pun intended for those of you who know what a lens is, in terms of double categories and lenses and charts. So trying to understand how different systems can actually be connected to each other, say like different lenses, blah, 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 whatever. We can talk about that later, and how especially their behavior is related. So if I give you two dynamical systems, and if I study their behavior, so their inputs and outputs, what can I tell you about those dynamical systems, especially if I cannot see their state? As I said, like, this is the stuff on the right is working. The stuff on the left is still not working, but it's something that I believe could be, you know, a good avenue for people still interested in claims made by the free energy principle. And with that, I'll leave it to Jyour for the second part, I guess, of this event. Thank you, everyone.